newfound friend. I've also spoken to her a couple of weeks before, and she's none other than Miss Ainslie Young, all the way from Newcastle in Australia, now living in Singapore. Ainslie.
Hi, Remy.
Hello there. Well, how about that sharing for the past, the last four speakers, Ainslie, is amazing, isn't it?
The speakers have been incredible. What incredible stories.
And you know what? Your story is equally incredible. And let's dive straight into it, because you are the special, the expert in this topic of pleasure. So when you speak of pleasure, so Ainslie, what do you mean? What do you mean exactly?
I'm glad you asked this question, because I'm curious as to how the audience might have responded when they heard the word pleasure, because what I often hear is a very narrow definition of pleasure thanks to modern media. And when they hear the word pleasure, they think of like sex and the erotic. But pleasure is far more comprehensive than that. And it's really important to know that pleasure is our birthright, particularly as women. And also it can be experienced on a spectrum. So we've got the pain end of the spectrum and the pleasure end of the spectrum. And often many of us kind of hang around in the pain end. And there's a reason for that, which I'll share. But in terms of pleasure, there's actually four kinds of pleasure, so four forms of it. And the first one is physical and like sensual. So we're activating our 5 different senses, okay? And then the second one is sexual and the erotic, also important. And the third one is emotional pleasure. So this is where we're getting our needs met through love, connection, affection, doing good things for other people, giving people hugs, etc. And then the fourth one is spiritual pleasure. And this is also known as bliss. So we can actually feel this when we're in deep states of meditation or we're doing body movement practice, and your heart actually feels like it's opening and there's like the free flowing of energy. And it's important to know the definition of pleasure, because once we're aware, as Saga said, then it's much easier for us to access it. And a lot of women are like that I work with in terms of prioritizing pleasure. Their definition, they just don't know what it is. And they kind of feel like, oh, everything has to be amazing and orgasmic, but there's a spectrum of pleasure as well. And pleasure can be like deep rest and a sense of peace and contentment. So I'm all about prioritizing pleasure, so that fuels our success in life and business, and it also makes it sustainable so we're not burning out.
So Ainslie, the thing is this, right? Because you mentioned that it's almost innate, that you're born with knowing and wanting and desiring for pleasure. But what makes it so difficult, especially for working adults with the corporate world right now, especially? What makes it so difficult to get access to that?
Yeah, great question. And I want everyone to know that if you feel like pleasure is really foreign to you, you're not alone. And like one of the biggest reasons why we all find it so challenging is because of these oppressive systems and structures that we all live under, like patriarchy, like toxic capitalism, like white supremacy. And a part of that is this myth of meritocracy. So what the myth of meritocracy is that hard work equals success. Now, I'm sure so many of us in here, particularly if we all own our own businesses, that's what we believe. Like if you work really, really hard, you're going to be rewarded. And that's what I obviously thought too, being a really ambitious woman, but I burnt out time and time again. And I'm sure many of us can think of people in our lives that have worked really, really hard, but not necessarily have achieved the goals that they desired. So that's a big myth that we need to bust. The second myth really comes around us not prioritizing pleasure because we see it as counterproductive. We're like, pleasure is just the reward. So for example, in our businesses, we'd be like, okay, well, I need to tick off those 5 things on our to-do list and then I can go and have a rest. Or I need to achieve X, Y, Z in my business and then I can have that 2-week holiday. But the thing is, if pleasure isn't a part of the journey, the reward isn't going to be pleasurable. So we really need to bring pleasure into the journey in order for that goal to be pleasurable, because often we get to the end and we burn out and we don't actually enjoy it, or we might not even get to that end goal because we burned out.
See, Ainsley, so far, whatever you're sharing reminds me of this Australian wine brand. I couldn't recall if it's Penfolds or Wyndham Estate, right? The tagline goes like this. It's just a very simple line: celebrate for no reason.
Yeah. And celebration, that's another thing that I'm really passionate about, particularly, again, for women and women in business. We don't celebrate. Like, we're just like, oh, and people in general, we're just like, oh, yeah, that's great. And we move on. And we have to be in the pleasure and the sensations of celebration. And that relates to our pleasure capacity. Often, like, we need to know that pleasure is a skill. It's within our nervous system, and we can grow its capacity over time. And celebration is a great way of really expanding your pleasure capacity.
See, another thing that really hits it back home for this is this. See, people sometimes make long-term plans, right, long-term goals. And you know what? The current way of thinking, that is sort of being discouraged because pleasure is being compromised along the way. Because like you've mentioned earlier on, by the time you get to your long-term goal, you might be too old to enjoy it, or you might be even dead before that. Right?
Exactly.
Right? And instead of having long-term goals and enjoying pleasure at the same time, why not we celebrate micro ambition and micro successes?
Yeah.
And so
absolutely.
when you look back, hey, you've done a lot and you're happy along the way, having pleasure along the way in the journey. And I think this is just so important, just to keep yourself happy and celebrating for no reason or for small wins.
Yeah,
What do you think?
definitely. because pleasure is the fuel. And like, I really loved hearing Shah and Saga and Gil as well, in terms of, like, I believe there's a framework around pleasure. So it's like the pleasure portal framework. And what pleasure can do is it can really amplify our power. So I feel like Shah was an awesome example, that she was in her pleasure when she was singing, and she was like, I'm just going to create all these music videos. Like, that takes a lot of personal power to do that. And then pleasure also helps you really connect into your purpose and that sense of impact and how you want to be of service.
So, sorry, I cut you off. You must say something very important.
Well, and then it also relates to productivity as well, because when we're in our pleasure, we are able to access greater sense of creativity, and we can move in a state of flow, and time ends up being on our side. We just create so much because we're coming from a place of overflow rather than a place of empty.
So you sort of answered the next question I'm about to ask you about the benefits of having pleasure. But let's pay attention to the chat room right now. There's a couple of questions for you, Ainsley. So one question from Irene is this really would take it home for sure. Right. It's firstly, how do you handle burnout from pleasure? Right. And secondly, and so what mind that it's okay to accept pleasure and to rest wholeheartedly. So what can we do? What are the ways to tell ourselves?
Yeah, such a great question. And this is what I work with clients on. And it's all about like unlearning, unraveling, and really reclaiming like the reverence of rest and pleasure. Because as I said, we've been socialized by the patriarchy, all of us, that, resting, we should be like, that's lazy and we feel guilty, right? And like pleasure in itself is shameful. Like if something's easy or it's enjoyable, like that doesn't go with the narrative, you must work hard in order to be successful. And also our value comes from, being more, doing more, having more, that success is linear, right? So it's a very narrow way of looking at life. But when it comes to like rest and pleasure, it's about you prioritizing it. And for me, pleasure is my guide. It never goes me wrong. Like I'm always asking myself, like, what would pleasure ask of me today? And it's about tuning into your body and what you actually need. So it might be starting the day, waking up half an hour before your kids. This is what I have to do an hour before, and going doing meditation. So then I start the day from a sense of fullness rather than giving. And that's another thing, like pleasure is feminine. It's all about receiving. And in our modern day lifestyles, because we kind of are very masculine in the way we all work. We're always giving, giving, giving. And we need to be in this spiral of give and receive, give and receive. And particularly as women, we need to be in receivership. So, asking for support and receiving it, taking downtime and really switching off. Yeah, so hopefully that gives a bit of insight there.
So if you were to combine Gail Petersale's sharing, how can I be of service to you? At the same time, acknowledging the fact that receiving is not shameful, it is about self-love and self-care, and recognizing that pleasure is such an important part of your life, and so that you can be productive.
Exactly.
It all comes to a big circle of all the speakers, right?
Yeah, that's what I love hearing. I was like, oh yes, I can pull all this in. And that's like, if we have to come from a state of overflow, and nobody is going to prioritize your pleasure except you, right? So it really is up to us, and honoring our bodies of work, our businesses, and honoring our roles as mothers, as wives, that we look after ourselves first. And I always say body first, business second, and that relates to pleasure. So we can be of service. We can have the impact that we desire to have in our businesses and in our lives.
So at the same time, that reminds me of something that we'll be experiencing very soon. And now that the borders are opening up, most of us are having the holiday plans by the end of the year. When you watch the safety video from that airline thing before we take off, right? In the unlikely event of a lack of emergency, please take care of yourself before taking care of someone else. It's almost like self-caring first, because if you don't take care of yourself, how are you going to take care of the person beside you? Yeah. And having pleasure is one of the most powerful ways to make sure you can function properly as a human being.
Absolutely. And it just makes you feel so alive. And when you're so, you're in your power, you're on purpose, the work you're doing is really aligned. And it also makes you more prosperous. This is really important, particularly for us in business, because pleasure is the gateway to magnetism. Again, this is more from a feminine energy lens. So when you're in your rest and digest part of your nervous system, your parasympathetic nervous system, that's when you can access pleasure. And it also makes your body, particularly your heart, because your heart is the most magnetic part of your body, easier to magnetize your desires towards you. So you're manifesting easier. So, with my clients, we're looking at, magnetizing dream clients, more revenue, greater opportunities, whatever the feelings they are that they want to really welcome into their lives and their business. So pleasure is so potent and powerful.
And people just sometimes forget.
We all do. We all do.
And so for friends and audiences who are watching this right now, please keep those comments coming in. I got lots and lots of questions for Ainslie, but basically time is always once again so precious and tight. And so I'm going to invite Ainslie just to have a bit of a micro, a zoom in takeaway just before we end your segment, and invite all the speakers back for a bit of a question and answer. So Ainslie, please let us know if there's one thing you want people to take away and take home from your segment. What will it be?
Prioritize your pleasure. It's the perfect path for you.
That's so powerful. So ladies and gentlemen, the expert in pleasure and knowing what's good for your body and listening to your body is Ainslie Young.